Hello, friends. Are you watching this alone or with someone? Tell me in the comments.
Picture this scenario unfolding in the heart of a bustling Chicago suburb where the autumn leaves swirl like forgotten promises around a family dinner table that I had meticulously designed and paid for through years of relentless real estate deals that transformed modest investments into a substantial portfolio capable of sustaining not just my independence, but also the unappreciated burdens of those closest to me. And there I sat, Emily Harper, a 45-year-old woman who had clawed her way from serving late-night shifts at diners to closing multi-million-dollar property flips in upscale neighborhoods like Naperville, feeling the weight of entitlement pressing down as my parents, Robert and Linda, leaned forward with those familiar expectant gazes that had become all too routine over the decades, declaring in unison with a tone laced with assumed authority that I should cover the entire cost of my sister Sarah's upcoming wedding, which they estimated at over $30,000. Given the current economic pressures and rising expenses for venues, catering, and all the trimmings that a modern American celebration demands, or else face the ultimate familial rejection of being declared no longer one of us in their eyes. A threat that carried the sting of betrayal because I had been the silent supporter for so long, wiring funds for emergencies, co-signing loans, and even providing a rent-free guest house on my own property where they had settled 5 years earlier after their own financial missteps left them without a safety net of their own making. My younger sister Sarah, 20 years my junior and perpetually drifting through life on a wave of charm and minimal effort, simply rolled her eyes from across the table while casually popping a cherry tomato into her mouth as if the demand were as trivial as choosing a salad dressing, adding her own dismissive comment that of course I could afford it since my success in real estate had always positioned me as the family's unofficial benefactor who could dip into savings without a second thought. Yet in that moment, as the lasagna on my plate suddenly lost all appeal and turned to tasteless ash in my mouth, I felt a profound shift inside. A quiet resolve building like the steady accumulation of equity in one of my best properties, and I set my fork down deliberately, allowing a smile to form not from warmth or compliance, but from the calculated armor of someone who had finally tallied the emotional debts owed and decided it was time to collect. That smile, steady and unyielding like the Lake Michigan shoreline against winter storms, masked the storm brewing within me as I responded with measured calm that yes, it was true I possessed the financial means to cover such an expense without denting my lifestyle. But I drew the line at subsidizing strangers who had overstayed their welcome in the very home I had built through my own sweat and strategic risks, informing them without raising my voice or adding unnecessary drama that they had precisely one day to vacate the guest house and remove all their belongings from the property that rightfully belonged to me alone, a declaration that hung in the air like the final clause in a binding contract. Simple and irrevocable in its intent to restore boundaries that had eroded over years of one-sided generosity. For a brief suspended moment, the room fell into a stunned silence broken only by the distant hum of neighborhood traffic, but then their reactions cascaded in waves of disbelief and mockery. With Dad slapping the oak table in a booming laugh that echoed his factory worker bravado from days gone by, insisting that I was pulling one of my classic jokes just to lighten the mood around such a serious family matter, while Mom waved her hand dismissively with a shake of her head calling me a drama queen in that affectionate yet patronizing way she had employed since my teenage rebellions, and Sarah snorted outright while already scrolling through wedding dress inspirations on her phone, dismissing the entire notion as utterly ridiculous because surely I wouldn't follow through on something so heartless against my own blood relations who had after all raised me and provided the foundation for the independence they now envied. I didn't engage in the back-and-forth arguments that could have escalated into the shouting matches of past holidays, nor did I defend my position with lists of every bailout I had extended from paying off Sarah's community college tuition when their budgets fell short to covering the down payment on her first unreliable car that she had totaled within months, or even the times I had absorbed the costs of family vacations where I was expected to foot the bill for everyone else's indulgences, while receiving only backhanded compliments about my so-called luck in the cutthroat world of property investment. Instead, I simply nodded in acknowledgement of their amusement, rose from the table with my plate in hand and walked to the sink where the running water provided a rhythmic backdrop to my thoughts, allowing them to clear out with their chuckles still ringing in the air as they dispersed to the living room for after-dinner TV. Completely convinced that my words were nothing more than empty bluster from a woman who had always prioritized family ties above her own solitude. Little did they know that I had already taken proactive steps earlier that very afternoon after overhearing Sarah on a phone call bragging to her fiancé Jake about how I would inevitably handle all the wedding logistics, just as I had managed so many of their crises before, reaching out to my trusted lawyer who specialized in property law and had helped me navigate the complexities of my divorce 5 years prior, ensuring that the eviction notice was prepared with all legal precision to make any resistance futile, and as I rinsed the remnants of the meal from my dish watching the suds spiral down the drain. In mesmerizing patterns, my phone vibrated softly on the counter with the first bank notification alerting me to an initiated transfer from one of the joint accounts I had established years ago for what was supposed to be family emergencies only. A subtle ping that sent a thrill through me, not of anxiety, but of anticipation, because this was merely the opening move in a larger strategy one had been quietly orchestrating for months ever since noticing those irregular withdrawals that didn't align with the explanations they provided during casual conversations over coffee. The evening light faded outside the window, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn that I had invested time and resources into maintaining as a symbol of the stability I had created for myself amid the chaos of familial dependencies. And I stood there pondering how long their laughter would endure once the reality of my resolve began to unfold in ways they could neither predict nor control, leaving me with a sense of empowered uncertainty about the path ahead, where every choice I made would test the fragile threads of loyalty that had bound us together for so long, threads that now felt ready to snap under the weight of unspoken truths waiting to surface. The morning after that tense dinner arrived with the crisp clarity of an Illinois autumn day where sunlight filtered through the canopy of turning leaves outside my window, casting golden patterns on the hardwood floors that I had refinished myself during one of those solitary weekends when the family demands had temporarily quieted, allowing me to reclaim a bit of the peace I so desperately craved. And as I rose early to brew a pot of strong black coffee, without any sugar to match the unyielding determination solidifying within me, I could already hear the faint stirrings from the guest house where Robert and Linda were likely starting their routines, oblivious to the seismic shift that had occurred over lasagna and entitlement the night before. So I dressed in practical jeans and a simple blouse that spoke to my no-nonsense approach to both business deals and personal boundaries, grabbed the printed eviction notice that my lawyer had expedited with all the legal rigor of a foreclosure proceeding, including the mandatory 30-day timeline softened slightly by my offer of a week's grace period if they cooperated without resistance, and stepped out into the cool air carrying the document like a declaration of independence from the cycle of one-sided support that had defined my relationships with them for far too long. Approaching the porch of the guest house where Dad sat in his worn recliner nursing a mug of weak tea and Mom fussed over a wilting houseplant that symbolized her tendency to nurture the superficial while neglecting the roots, I extended the paperwork without preamble or apology, explaining in a voice steady as the foundations of the properties I flipped that this was no jest from the previous evening, but a formal requirement for them to vacate the premises by the specified date, gathering all their possessions, including the miscellaneous tools Dad had scattered in my shed and the knickknacks Mom had accumulated over 5 years of rent-free living that had conveniently allowed them to sidestep any real accountability for their financial choices after Dad's retirement evaporated under poor investments and Mom's library job proved insufficient to cover even basic utilities. Dad snatched the notice with a furrowed brow, scanning the legalese as if expecting a loophole to emerge like one of his half-baked get-rich schemes from the past, grumbling in his gruff factory-accented tone that this entire affair was not only unfunny, but downright unchristian given our shared bloodline and the unspoken pact of family solidarity that he believed exempted them from such mundane realities as rent payments or reciprocity, while Mom peered over his shoulder, her eyes widening in Feigned shock before she launched into a litany of emotional appeals about how they had sacrificed everything to raise me, including enduring long hours and tight budgets, so that I could pursue my dreams in real estate, which now ironically positioned me to cast them aside like obsolete fixtures in one of my renovation projects. I leaned against the railing, maintaining my composure, and responded that true family support flowed in both directions, a lesson they seemed to have forgotten amid their assumptions of my endless resources, which had funded everything from Sarah's tuition shortfalls to emergency car repairs without so much as a handwritten thank you note to acknowledge the strain it placed on my own carefully balanced life, especially after my divorce, when emotional support from them amounted to little more than perfunctory phone calls laced with unsolicited advice rather than genuine empathy. Just then Sarah emerged from the house, her hair tousled from sleep and robe loosely tied in that effortlessly disheveled manner she wielded like a weapon of casual entitlement, snatching the paper from Dad's hand and skimming it with a scoff before tossing it onto the small table, declaring that I must be serious about this absurd overreaction to a simple wedding request, as if evicting one's parents and sister over $30,000 for a vineyard venue with 200 guests, an open bar, and all the trimmings was the height of pettiness, when Jake's family was only contributing a measly $5,000, leaving the bulk to fall on my shoulders as the perpetually reliable sibling who had bailed her out of boyfriend's bad jobs and bounced checks since she was old enough to dial my number. I met her gaze, seeing the polished veneer of confidence crack just enough to reveal the underlying panic about starting her married life in financial quicksand of vulnerability that tugged at the big sister instincts I had suppressed for years, but I countered with a light chuckle infused with the wry humor born from too many similar standoffs that memories and family bonds were indeed priceless, yet they didn't magically cover caterers or photographers, so if she wanted my involvement, perhaps contributing through a part-time gig at one of the event companies around Chicago would demonstrate the kind of partnership she expected from me rather than the one-way street they had paved with my money and their expectations. By midday, the guest house had transformed into a reluctant whirlwind of activity, with boxes haphazardly stacked in the driveway resembling the cluttered aftermath of a yard sale, where forgotten items surfaced like Dad's dusty golf clubs that he had never paid for despite my covering green fees during family outings, and Mom's collection of mismatched china wrapped in tissue paper I had purchased during a bulk shopping trip intended for their convenience, while Sarah blasted upbeat music from her phone to drown out the tension as she texted Jake updates on the so-called family drama, painting me as the unreasonable antagonist in their shared narrative of victimhood. I kept my distance, working from my home office overlooking the scene, where the knot in my stomach twisted between a sense of liberation from their daily intrusions and the lingering guilt that any middle-aged American listening might feel compelled to attribute to me for prioritizing property rights over parental piety, especially when visions of holiday gatherings and lifelong sacrifices flickered in the mind's eye, urging a softer approach to what could be mended with forgiveness and a checkbook. As the afternoon waned and the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the lawn, I received an unexpected call from an unfamiliar local number, answering with professional caution, only to hear the voice of a bank representative confirming the pause on the recurring transfer to our joint family account that I had initiated quietly months earlier as a preliminary measure against the odd withdrawals I had begun noticing like ghosts in the financial statements, and although the representative assured me it was routine verification, my mind raced to the implications as laughter once again spilled from the guest house, where they seemed to be toasting their temporary discomfort with cheap wine, convinced that my resolve would crumble under familial pressure. Hanging up, I pulled up the banking app on my laptop, my eyes narrowing at a fresh notification highlighting unusual activity in the form of a pending withdrawal from an old linked account tied to Dad's failed business venture that I had co-signed out of youthful optimism a decade ago, the amount substantial enough to cover several months of their lifestyle, and the timestamp suspiciously recent, suggesting not just oversight, but deliberate probing of limits that extended far beyond the wedding demands into territories of trust one had long taken for granted, leaving me staring at the screen with a pulse quickening in anticipation of the deeper deceptions that this eviction might unearth, like buried foundations in one of my renovation sites, ready to shift the entire structure of our family dynamics in ways none of us could yet foresee. What began as a reluctant packing effort the previous day had escalated into full-blown pandemonium by midday on the designated move-out stretch, where boxes teetered precariously on my pristine driveway like the unstable stacks of undervalued properties I had once avoided in my early flipping days, each one stuffed with a lifetime's worth of accumulated clutter that spoke volumes about the ways my family had nested comfortably in my space, without ever considering the invisible toll it exacted on my sense of ownership and personal sanctuary. And as I observed from the shaded porch, sipping a glass of iced tea that cut through the autumn warmth with its tart lemon bite, I couldn't help but feel a twisted amusement at the spectacle of Robert heaving his collection of rusted tools into the back of a rented U-Haul truck, while grumbling under his breath about the sheer audacity of a daughter turning her parents into nomads in their golden years, his back already protesting the unaccustomed labor that he had delegated to hired hands during better financial times funded indirectly by my real estate windfalls. Linda fluttered about wrapping her delicate china pieces in layers of tissue paper that I had stocked in the guest house linen closet during one of my organizational purges, her movements frantic yet laced with that performative drama she reserved for moments when sympathy might sway outcomes, pausing every few minutes to shoot me accusatory glances as if I were the villain in some suburban soap opera for enforcing boundaries that any self-respecting homeowner in the Chicago area would uphold against indefinite freeloading. And Sarah orchestrated the chaos from the sidelines with her phone perpetually in hand directing Jake over speakerphone about where to position the heavier furniture, while blasting a playlist of upbeat wedding anthems that clashed absurdly with the underlying tension, turning what should have been a straightforward relocation into a marathon of delays and deflections. They dragged their feet with calculated inefficiency from the start, Dad conveniently discovering a loose shelf in the garage that required immediate repair before any boxes could be sealed, and Mom insisting on one final load of laundry in my machine because the laundromat fees would bankrupt them overnight, tactics that tested my patience like a drawn-out negotiation with a stubborn seller who knew the market favored them just enough to hold out, yet I held firm, refusing to intervene or offer extensions beyond the grace period already extended, because this wasn't about cruelty, but about reclaiming the equity of effort I had poured into this property and life, while they treated it as an extension of their own entitlements, including the Wi-Fi bandwidth Sarah burned through on endless scrolls for bridal registries, and the fresh produce from my garden that supplemented their meals without a single offer to weed or water in return. Sarah finally took a break, mid-afternoon, collapsing onto the concrete steps beside me with a dramatic sigh, her robe swapped for yoga pants and a tank top smeared with dust from rummaging through closets. And she fixed me with that trademark eye roll before launching into a tirade about how utterly ridiculous it was to subject them to crashing at Jake's cramped apartment that barely accommodated two, let alone a family of four, scrambling for space amid his accountant's desk clutter and her wedding planning binders, questioning with a sharpness honed from years of getting her way whether this eviction charade was truly over a mere wedding budget when the Vineyard venue alone demanded $15,000 for the site and setup, not to mention the catering for 200 guests, expecting upscale fare like filet mignon and craft cocktails that would set the tone for her new life with Jake, whose modest contributions from his parents covered only the barest fraction, leaving the emotional and financial heavy lifting squarely on my doorstep as the successful sibling who had always stepped up from tuition gaps to car rescues. I sat there feeling the warmth of the steps seep through my jeans, the concrete a grounding reminder of the solid foundations I had built, unlike the shifting sands of their dependencies, and responded with a soft chuckle that carried the dry humor of someone who had negotiated tougher deals over lukewarm coffee in dingy conference rooms that know this wasn't pettiness, but a necessary recalibration of give and take where families stuck together only if everyone pulled their weight, suggesting she might consider a side hustle at one of the event staffing agencies dotting the suburbs, plenty of opportunities for someone with her organizational flair to earn toward those custom invitations and photo booths without relying on the sister who had already fronted more than her share, including the emotional labor of mediating their squabbles during holidays when all I craved was quiet reflection on my own uncelebrated milestones, like the divorce that left me rebuilding solo while they vacationed on my dime. For a fleeting instant her facade cracked, revealing the wide-eyed uncertainty of a woman on the cusp of vows she might not fully afford, the vulnerability tugging at my resolve, and making me wonder if listeners in their mid-40s to 60s nursing their own resentments toward ungrateful kin would secretly applaud my stance or cluck their tongues at the hardness creeping into what should be unbreakable bonds forged in childhood memories of shared suppers and scraped knees. But that momentary softness evaporated when Dad bellowed from inside about a mysteriously missing checkbook that he swore had been in the nightstand drawer just yesterday, prompting me to rise and distance myself, retreating to the cool confines of my home office, where the glow of my laptop screen became a portal into the financial undercurrents I had begun to suspect ran deeper than surface level. Mooching. Diving into the banking app with the focus of auditing a questionable property title, I scrutinized the paused transfer, which was merely the tip of an iceberg comprising $500 monthly allowances I had tolerated as gestures of goodwill, but now the pending withdrawal from that decade-old linked account tied to Dad's ill-fated business attempt loomed larger, a $10,000 probe that originated from an IP address pinpointed to the very suburb we shared, suggesting not random error but intentional overreach that chilled me more than the air conditioning humming overhead. And as I initiated another block, my fingers hovering over the keys, I pieced together subtler anomalies like Mom's unexplained new necklace glinting during Christmas dinner or Sarah's designer handbag appearing post my last wire transfer, coincidences that now reeked of coordinated pilfering from the joint pot I had established out of naive optimism back when family meant unassailable trust. Night descended gradually, the driveway lit by the U-Haul's headlights as they loaded the final stragglers, their laughter forced and intermittent like echoes of denial, and just as I prepared to log off, another notification pierced the quiet, a stark alert proclaiming the initiation of a full account freeze on the joint holdings, not by my hand, but triggered automatically by the bank's fraud detection protocols in response to the escalating irregularities, leaving me to stare at the message with a heart pounding in a cocktail of vindication and unease, because who else held the keys to this labyrinth of linked finances, and what other skeletons lurked in the statements waiting to tumble out during Sarah's impending desperate plea that I could already sense brewing in the shadows of their reluctant departure. The days immediately following their reluctant departure from the guest house stretched into a deceptive calm where my property regained its quiet rhythm, with birdsong replacing the constant murmur of familial discord, and the driveway cleared of U-Haul shadows, allowing me to focus on pending real estate closings that demanded my sharp attention amid the lingering echoes of their complaints. Yet that fragile peace shattered almost instantly under a barrage of phone calls that began with Mom's tearful voicemails pleading about Dad's aching back from the unaccustomed hauling of boxes, and how they had been forced into a dingy budget motel on the outskirts of town where the thin walls amplified every creak and conversation, turning their temporary refuge into a nightly reminder of the eviction sting, each message laced with subtle barbs about my hardness of heart, as if 5 years of free housing and utilities weren't ample repayment for the raising they invoked like a perpetual IOU in our interactions. I fielded these pleas with measured detachment, wiring them $1,000 for a security deposit on a modest rental in the adjacent suburb, but only after insisting on a signed no-contact agreement for at least a month to give everyone space to process the fractures I had deliberately widened, a condition that felt as pragmatic as any lease clause I drafted in my professional life, yet carried the weight of emotional arbitrage that might make any listener in their 40s to 60s pause and question whether I was exacting too steep a price for boundaries long overdue, especially when family lore painted me as the dutiful daughter who should absorb such disruptions with grace rather than grids of legalese. Sarah's confrontation arrived unannounced a week later when she strode into my downtown Chicago office, her heels clicking authoritatively against the marble floors as if she owned the high-rise space I had leased after my first major flip success, slamming a thick folder onto my desk that bulged with meticulously itemized wedding expenses, from the Vineyard venue's $15,000 booking fee to the custom invitations and photo booth rentals, pushing the total perilously close to $35,000 a figure she thrust forward with a glare demanding immediate resolution, because Jake's family contributions topped out at a paltry $5,000, leaving the parents tapped out and her future marital bliss teetering on the edge of cancellation. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the leather sighing in sympathy with my fraying patience, flipping through the glossy printouts that detailed open bars stocked with premium liquors and floral arrangements rivaling those in bridal magazines she devoured during her stays at my house, and responded with a wry chuckle infused with the ironic humor of someone who had stared down worse deadlines in volatile markets that no, this wasn't about denying her the aisle walk, but about ending the pattern where my successes subsidized their whims without reciprocal effort, reminding her pointedly of the 3 measly days they had hosted me post-divorce before hinting at space constraints while I navigated the wreckage of that failed marriage alone, funding my own therapy sessions and fresh starts. Her face contorted in a mix of fury and desperation, pacing the office with gestures that swept perilously close to knocking over my model skyline. She accused me of harboring jealousy over her impending nuptials, a big day I had never claimed for myself. After Tom's betrayal left me wary of vows and veils, yet her words landed like a poorly timed counteroffer, stinging the unresolved ache of what might have been while she stormed toward the door, pausing to hurl a parting shot about Dad mentioning my inheritance from Grandma, as if that modest estate divided solely to me for my dutiful nursing home visits could be leveraged to bail them out once more, ignoring the will's explicit terms that favored the granddaughter, who showed up with more than empty promises. That barb lingered like a bad aftertaste, prompting me to unearth old emails and documents from my secure cloud storage, where a forged power of attorney signature in Dad's unmistakable scrawl jumped out from a file dated years after Grandma's passing, authorizing subtle diversions from the trust into accounts benefiting Sarah's so-called education, a revelation that sent ice through my veins because it transformed their mooching from habitual laziness into calculated betrayal, eroding the last vestiges of doubt about the depth of their entitlements. The bank alerts escalated in tandem with this discovery, another ping notifying me of an overdraft protection denial on a linked card, likely theirs, as they attempted to charge motel extensions or Sarah's dress fittings, the rejections piling up like unpaid invoices in a stalled deal, fueling my resolve to orchestrate a more layered revenge, not through outright confrontation, but by quietly rerouting any remaining accessible funds toward a charity supporting single mothers rebuilding after setbacks, a poetic justice that mirrored my own post-divorce reinvention and carried the witty sting of turning their pilfered portions into aid for those truly deserving without fanfare or fury. That evening, as twilight painted the city skyline in bruised purples, a hesitant knock echoed at my front door, revealing Jake standing there with a 6-pack of craft beer, his usually polished accountant demeanor rumpled by exhaustion and conflict, asking if we could talk away from Sarah's escalating hysterics over the frozen finances that had already derailed vendor deposits and rehearsal dinner plans. We settled on the porch under the string lights I had installed for solitary evenings, the beers cracking open with a hiss that released some of the bottled tension, as he confessed in halting sentences about the parents' habit of borrowing from that forgotten family fund tied to Grandma's legacy. $10,000 already vanished into Sarah's future fund, with assumptions I would never scrutinize the books closely enough to notice their sleight of hand, painting a picture of favoritism where my contributions were footnotes to their favored daughter's narrative, a dynamic that twisted the knife of sibling rivalry into something far more insidious than wedding woes. I absorbed his words with a bitter laugh, low and disbelieving, remarking that borrowing equated to theft when cloaked in family smiles, and sent him away with a firm warning to distance himself from their schemes, lest he inherit the fallout. But sleep proved elusive that night, my mind churning through scenarios of legal maneuvers, like consulting my attorney about restitution claims that could tie up their meager assets in countersuits, while the idea of full exposure simmered as the ultimate clever payback. Dawn crept in with the first light filtering through blinds, carrying an anonymous text to my phone that read simply, Check this safety deposit box. Truth hurts. The sender's number blocked, and origin untraceable, sparking a cascade of questions about who among them harbored enough guilt or spite to tip this hand, and what buried artifacts from Grandma's era waited in that vault too. Upend the fragile equilibrium I had fought to impose, leaving me dressing hurriedly for a bank visit with hands trembling at the precipice of revelations that could either vindicate my hardening stance or unravel the very foundations of the family I was systematically dismantling. The anonymous text from the previous night lingered in my mind like an unresolved clause in a convoluted property contract, pulling me through the snarl of Chicago morning traffic, where horns blared in rhythmic frustration and the skyline loomed as a testament to the ambitions I had chased while my family chipped away at the foundations from afar. So I navigated the familiar route to the bank downtown, the one housing Grandma's long-forgotten safety deposit box, with a sense of foreboding curiosity that quickened my steps past the teller stations and into the vault's cool metallic embrace, where the air carried the faint scent of aged paper and sealed secrets untouched since her passing a decade earlier. The teller unlocked the compartment with practiced efficiency, handing me the key card and a pair of white gloves that felt absurdly formal for delving into family ghosts. But as I lifted the lid, inside lay a modest array of relics, including her simple gold locket etched with initials that evoked childhood visits to her nursing home, where I had been the sole granddaughter, showing up with fresh flowers and attentive ears, while Sarah preferred video calls and Dad focused on the inheritance windfall. Yet it was the envelope in her shaky handwriting addressed solely to me that drew my breath short, containing not just heartfelt words about how they never truly deserved her trust, but also photocopies of altered trust documents bearing Dad's forged signature on a power of attorney form that retroactively diverted $20,000 over the years into accounts earmarked for Sarah's education and future, a betrayal that crystallized in stark black ink, transforming their casual mooching into premeditated theft from the very legacy meant to secure my independence after the sacrifices she had witnessed in my early struggles. Back at home, I spread the contents across the kitchen table, the same one that had hosted the wedding demand just weeks prior, feeling a surge of vindication mingled with the bitter ache of confirmation that their chuckles and eye rolls masked a deeper pattern of favoritism, where I served as the unwitting pillar propping up Sarah's carefree trajectory from community college dropouts to designer dreams funded by pilfered portions of what should have been mine alone to rebuild after Tom's divorce blindsided me, leaving me to flip properties through sleepless nights without their emotional scaffolding beyond platitudes. As if scripted by some ironic playwright, my phone erupted in a frenzy of notifications, each one a digital dagger detailing the fallout from the account freezes I had initiated and the bank's automated fraud responses cascading across the screen, with alerts for insufficient funds on the wedding vendor payments, where the florist's deposit bounced spectacularly, the catering quote for filet mignon and craft cocktails evaporated into overdraft notices, and even the modest motel reservation for Robert and Linda dissolved, forcing them into last-minute scrambles that undoubtedly amplified their panic into full-blown desperation. I could envision the scenes unfolding: Sarah at the bridal boutique, watching her card decline mid-try-on for that perfect gown, her face flushing with the humiliation of public rejection, while Mom clutched an empty purse at the checkout counter, realizing their linked line had been severed, and Dad stared at his phone in disbelief as golf club dues and utility attempts all met the same unyielding wall of rejection, a symphony of denials that carried the witty precision of my revenge, not through shouted accusations, but through the quiet efficiency of financial autonomy reclaimed drop by drop, like equity accruing in a well-managed portfolio. The doorbell's insistent chime cut through the alert storm, pulling me to the entrance, where they stood disheveled and defeated, Robert with sweat beading on his brow from the drive, Linda's eyes puffy from crying, and Sarah hauling a suitcase, as if ready for battle. Their collective presence filling the foyer with the scent of fast food desperation and unresolved grudges, as Dad pushed past, bellowing about how our cards had inexplicably stopped working, with the wedding planner phoning in hysterics over halted everything from venue holds to rehearsal dinners, turning their dream event into a logistical nightmare that demanded my immediate intervention. Mom collapsed onto the couch, her sobs punctuating pleas for mercy, invoking the sacred ties of blood and upbringing, while Sarah zeroed in with a voice cracking under the strain, accusing me outright of orchestrating this freeze-out as payback for the eviction, a low blow that stripped them bare just when unity should prevail. Yet I gestured calmly to the table's revelations, unfolding the forged documents and Grandma's letter in a tableau of truth that silenced their outrage into stunned gasps. Sarah, stammering that it had been merely a loan for her schooling, a necessary bridge during tough times, while Dad deflated, mumbling about economic pressures that justified borrowing without permission, his excuses crumbling like over-leveraged investments under scrutiny. In the charged silence, I explained with a light, disbelieving laugh that hoarding wasn't my vice, but sharing had been theirs to excess, turning my home into a haven and my accounts into their slush fund. So, in a final twist of clever retribution, I revealed the rerouted remnants of those siphoned funds, now directed to a shelter for single mothers navigating fresh starts, much like my own post-divorce odyssey, a wedding gift of sorts that empowered those overlooked rather than enabling endless entitlement, leaving them to absorb the sting of independence they had long evaded. They departed in fractured silence, promises of legal recourse and renewed disownments hanging like storm clouds as their car backed down the drive, the engine's rumble fading into the afternoon haze. But as I watched the taillights disappear, another notification arrived. Not of loss, but restoration, the full trust reverting to my sole control, a quiet victory that settled over me like the calm after a closing deal. Yet in that solitude, staring at the empty driveway and the letters fading, ink doubt crept in unbidden, making me question if I had pushed too far, shattering the mosaic of family into irreparable shards, or if this severance was the freedom middle-aged hearts like mine and yours crave after decades of giving without gauge, whether reconciliation flickered on some distant horizon, or if the truths unearthed had buried any chance of mending, leaving the final verdict ambiguous in the balance of loyalty and self-preservation that lingers long after the notifications cease.